Time now to talk Pollie Waffle with our favourite Pollie Waffle. It is, of course, Senator Mathias Cormann. Welcome back.
Good to be here.
Of course, Senator Mathias is... Oh, thank you. Clap for the Senator. Of course, the Liberal WA member for the Senate, and we thank you for coming back again. Now, last week, the Prime Minister spelt out our policy on climate change.
The carbon tax we weren't going to have.
Yes. Tell us what you felt about it. What came out?
Well, I mean, I've been travelling around Australia for the last week, and what we've got here is a carbon tax proposal, which is, of course, a broken promise because the Prime Minister told us before the election that there would be no carbon tax under a government she leads. And, I mean, this carbon tax will push up the cost of everything. It'll make us less competitive internationally. It'll cost jobs. It'll hurt small business. And all of that without doing anything to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions.
We heard after she released her policy, 60% of Australians in a poll that came out were anti this carbon tax. Now, why do you think the public are so hell-bent at not having a carbon tax? Why are they so against it?
Well, I think the public now understands that it's a bad policy. I mean, you've got to remember, we've been having a debate about this now for the last 3 or 4 years. And people understand that if you make overseas polluters more competitive than even the most environmentally efficient equivalent business in Australia, then all you're doing is shifting emissions overseas, shifting jobs overseas. That is not effective action on climate change. That is an irresponsible act of economic self-harm that doesn't do anything to reduce emissions.
I've heard a lot of commentators come out and say this week that the public has switched off because of the so-called lie when the Prime Minister said...
Well, it's not a so-called lie, it is a lie.
Well, she says, you know, she had a difference of opinion, she changed her mind. She says people do that, which is fair enough. But before the election, the Prime Minister did promise Australians that there would be no carbon tax. And then after the election, she changed her mind due to the Greens putting pressure on her. We all know that. But we've heard so much about this so-called lie. And earlier last week, the Prime Minister was confronted in a shopping centre. Let's have a look at the footage. Now, this happened in a shopping centre over east, and...
Well, I can talk to you. And why are you continuing to lie? And you're still lying. The thing that sticks in my craw...
What was this all about?
Well, I mean, this is... people across Australia are angry because they were promised by the Prime Minister before the election there would be no carbon tax on the government she leads. Now, you say that she's changed her mind, and of course, Prime Ministers are entitled to change their mind, but what she should be doing is if she thinks that she's got a package that is such a good idea for Australia, she should take it to an election. If she thinks that the carbon tax is good for Australia, she should sell her package and then take it to an election so that people across Australia can pass judgment on it at the ballot box.
I agree with you, and I think a lot of Australians agree with you. Last week on Q&A, she was asked that question, why don't you allow a referendum? And she did make the comment that she felt that she wanted the tax to come in for 2 years. Then if the people don't like it, then they can vote her out. And do you think that's the right way to take it?
Well, but this is the whole point. I mean, like, clearly the reason she didn't tell people about it before the last election is because she knows that this is an unpopular tax. The reason it is unpopular is because people know that it will hurt their budgets, it will hurt the economy, and all of that without doing anything to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, people care about the environment. People are prepared to make a sacrifice to improve the environment. But what people get really angry about is that they're being asked to make a sacrifice without it actually making any difference. And if Julia Gillard thought it was such a good idea to have a carbon tax, why didn't she tell us that that's what she was going to do before the election? There's one reason why she didn't tell us. She knew that it was a hotly contested election. She knew that she was in trouble. And she knew that if she had been open and upfront about her plans for a carbon tax before the election, that she probably would have lost the election.
Let me ask you this question. Had she won the election, the federal election in her own right, with a majority, do you think she'd be introducing this tax?
Well, no, because she made a promise, an absolutely emphatic promise, that there would be no carbon tax under government.
So you think the Greens...
Well, there's one party, there's only one party that went to the election promising a $23 a tonne carbon tax, and that is the Greens party. And the Greens are the only party that went to the election promising a $23 a tonne carbon tax.
I mean, I heard also the Prime Minister say that a $23 per tonne charge or carbon tax is good for jobs. And Tony Abbott made the claim, well, why don't you put it up to 46, because then it'll be even better for jobs.
Well, the thing is, I mean, they're telling a lot of lies still. Like Wayne Swan and Julia Gillard say how Treasury modelling supposedly shows that jobs will continue to grow under the carbon tax. Well, that's not true. The Treasury modeling doesn't show anything of the sort. It assumes it. So what you've got, Treasury is putting an assumption into their modeling that jobs will continue to grow. And then after having put the assumption in, imposed a rule onto the model that jobs will continue to grow, they then say, oh, well, look, our modeling shows that jobs are going to continue to go up. There's a lot of dishonesty in this debate still today.
Tell me about the 500 companies. How did they choose? They're saying before it was 1,000, now there's going to be 500 of the top polluters. How do they know who these companies are? And when will we know who these companies are?
Well, they're trying to keep it very secret. I mean, a lot of the companies have identified themselves. And I mean, Julia Gillard keeps talking about the big polluters. And of course, what she calls the big polluters, they are the big energy generators that make sure that our lights stay on. And they're also the big employers, many of whom have made significant efforts over the last 20 years to reduce their energy intensity, to become more energy efficient, to reduce their emissions. I've visited quite a few of them over this last week. And when you look at the efforts they went through to reduce their emissions without any carbon tax whatsoever, it is really quite inspirational. And like, this is the whole point. Many of those equivalent producers in China would pollute much more for the same production effort as equivalent companies would in Australia. So by making them more competitive, by helping them take market share away from Australian businesses, what you're actually doing, you're arguably making things worse for the environment because emissions are going to go up by more.
What's the real story about the coal industry? Is it going to be shut down? Is that what the government's trying to achieve? Or because they're saying the coal industry has a great future?
Well, the Greens keep saying that they want to shut down the coal industry. And of course, the Treasury modeling shows, I mean, right now, the coal is about 70% of our energy mix. And Treasury modeling shows that the goal is to bring that down to 10%.
So how do you bring it down to 10% and still have a fantastic coal industry?
Well, to be honest, I think it's completely unrealistic. I mean, right now, I mean, coal, from my point of view, for the sort of short to medium term future, is going to continue to be an important part of our energy mix. There is no reliable and adequate energy source other than coal and gas that can really take its place. I mean, wind, solar, they all, we all want to see them do well, but they can't provide reliable, adequate baseload power.
Talking about alternatives, can you spell out for me, I know you're not the spokesman on climate change, but you know enough about it. Tell us how the opposition's policy on climate change differs.
Well, we want to provide incentives rather than to impose a penalising tax. We've got our direct action policy, which is focused on reducing emissions by 5% by 2020 on 2000 levels, and it's aiming to deliver that by planting more trees on suitable land, by improving our soil management, and also by investing in technology improvements. Like, there's a lot that we can do to clean up coal-fired power stations, for example. So what will be, it's a fully funded, fully costed policy. It'll cost about $3.2 billion over the forward estimates, which we would be funding out of savings. And like, one of the tragedies of the uncertainty created by Julia Gillard over the last 3 years, and Kevin Rudd before her, is that there hasn't been much investment in cleaning up coal-fired power stations because nobody knows what the future for coal-fired power generation holds. But there is actually a lot that we can do, reducing the emissions intensity for coal-fired power stations by investing in better technology. And what we'll be doing is we'll be, through a market-based mechanism, we'd be tendering for the lowest cost abatement opportunities out in the marketplace.
See, I see the carbon tax personally, and I know a lot of people said to me the same thing. We see it like a speed camera fine. If you get a fine, you know it's not illegal, but you'll just keep speeding and keep paying the fine. Now, I see the carbon tax the same way. If big companies who are wealthy already keep polluting and they know all they're going to do is pay a fine, which they'll then pass on as price increases, where is the environment going to be better?
Well, I mean, that's exactly right. And I mean, the problem is, like, electricity prices are going to go up by 10%, gas prices are going to go up by 9%, and that's just for starters.
And
because
we believe fuel might be coming back into it.
That's right, and the carbon tax is going to go up and up and up every year. And when it's renamed into the emissions trading scheme, it'll spike up again. And I mean, this is a tax which is supposed to raise $9 billion in its first year of operation. That is a significant tax. And the most ridiculous thing out of all of this is that the budget is actually going to be $4.3 billion worse off. I mean, I would argue only the Labour Party can come up with a new multi-billion-dollar tax which leaves the budget $4.3 billion worse off than when we started.
So where are we going with this? Where do you think it's going to go?
Well, I mean, clearly the government is going to try and introduce legislation. I suspect that public opinion is going to continue to...
Do you think she'll buckle? Because last week at the press gallery, she was actually quite emotional. She was quite sad. Do you think the government may buckle and say, OK, we'll drop it? Or
well, after a couple of days meeting real people out in the community, she realised how unpopular this very bad tax is. And so she went back to Canberra, where she sort of, I guess, was among friends. I mean, the press gallery in Canberra is very supportive.
I suppose Parliament will be the telling sign. When does Parliament begin again?
Well, Parliament is going to be back 16 August.
So
and
look,
weeks. On the face of it, in Parliament, she has got the numbers right now.
So she can pass the legislation. The Senate will probably pass into law?
Well, the interesting thing to watch is how the strength of feeling across Australia is going to influence Labor members and senators. You've got to remember, every single Labor member and senator supported Julia Gillard's promise that there would be no carbon tax under the government she leads. And as you've got this backlash, this public backlash, it'll be interesting to see whether they really will persist with it.
And I think the independents will be the ones to watch as well, whether they'll backflip and say, OK, we won't support it, it's not popular.
Well, I mean, it's time that the independents and the government start listening to the Australian people. And the people don't want this carbon tax.
Well, you keep doing a great job. This is Senator Mathias Cormann, of course, from the Liberal Party of WA. We'll talk to you again very soon and see what progress we've made with this. But keep fighting on behalf of the people. Right. Thank you very much. Can we give him a round of applause, please? Senator Mathias Cormann in the studio. Thank you very much.